So, yeah, so my this short talk is going to be on the theme of India, freedom, nationhood, and dreams. So this is exactly what we want to think about during our okay. I hope you can still see the slide, right?
Yes, sir. We are
Okay.
able to see.
Great, great. Okay. So India, freedom, nationhood, and dreams. So this is really we want to, think about and contemplate upon on this important occasion of uh, Independence Day, 75th anniversary. So I want to start with some quotes. See, we often take freedom for granted, right? So freedom, so we of course grow up in a free country. We live in a free democratic society. So often we don't really get the value of this freedom. But it's something so precious for human life and indeed for all of us. So our famous Mahakavi, Subramanya Bharati, so he said, Tannir vitto valartho, ippairai kanniral katho. So he wrote these lines in a deep anguish when the patriots and freedom fighters were undergoing trials and tribulations at the hands of the British colonial rule. Did we nurture this plant merely by water? We protected it with our tears, he said. He says, Kanniral Kato. So what does this mean? So this freedom that we enjoy today, there is so much of tears, blood, and sweat behind this. So much sacrifices, so much hard work. So many people have laid their lives down to get this freedom. Why? Because freedom is the first sign of life and growth and progress and everything that matters for humans. So this is why Bal Gangadhar Tilak, he said, Swaraj is my birthright and I must have it. So Tilak, what he meant is that freedom is something so natural. Everything in nature strives for freedom. Nothing, no species in nature wants to be bound and controlled. It wants to express itself freely. So for any individual, for any society, for any nation, freedom is birthright. So it is worth fighting for and getting and protecting freedom. So that's what Tilak meant when he said, Swaraj is my birthright, I must have it. And Swami Vivekananda, another great builder of modern India, he asks, if we are not free, how can we even hope to make the world better? Anything, a true knowledge can blossom only in a free environment, when you have freedom. And he says, true love is possible only among people who are free. Among slaves, true love is not possible. True ideals of justice, all human values that we so cherish, everything can be nurtured and grown only in an environment where there is freedom. So freedom is something that is worth fighting for and worth protecting. So that this is something that we have to, anchor in our mind, particularly youngsters. We often hear, instances in our country where a law enforcement officer like police, he goes and asks people to wear the COVID mask, and then we see some youngsters responding, oh, why should I wear the mask? This is a free country. That's a very wrong way of understanding freedom. So freedom has a very positive connotation. So freedom is the enabler of the order and discipline and overall progress of everyone in the society. So that is the ideal that all these great leaders of our country gave us. When we talk about India as a nation, we are celebrating the 75th, we are going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Indian independence. So does that mean that India is just 75 years old? Was India born on 15th August 1947? No nation existed before that? Then what were people even fighting for? So these questions normally arise. And often some people say that the whole idea of nationhood is defined by constitution, right? So whatever is written in the constitution, that gives some fundamental rights to the citizens, and we enjoy those rights. We have some duty towards the nation, and constitution is what defines the nationhood and everything. So the whole idea of patriotism, nation, everything starts and stops with constitution. This is what some people say, but this is a very reductionist view, and obviously it is incorrect. The Indian nationhood is not just constitutional. Some people say, it is just geographical. We live in a territory. So because we live in this land, Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Kamaruk to Kutch, as they say, bound by these geographical limits. So that makes us the residents of this territory. So that's what defines the Indian nationhood. So whoever lives in this geography, they are all the people of this nation, and it is the geography which defines the nationhood. So there is some truth in it, but again, this is not a complete the truth. It's not complete. It is still reductionist. So what is Indian nationhood? What is its real character? It is civilizational. So India is not just a state in the modern sense, the way the nation states are defined. It is not just a nation in the modern sense. It is a civilization. A civilization that is 5,000, 7,000, 10,000, we don't know, which is time immemorial. So just to drive this point, the pictures that I have shown in this slide, so these are actually in the 1950, when they drafted the Indian Constitution, they printed some deluxe edition of it because they wanted to preserve it as a book, in the book form. So when the Constitution was printed, the founding fathers of Indian Republic, they wanted some paintings to convey the true feelings of the Indian nation. And these paintings are actually present in the book of Constitution. So on top you see Rama, Lakshmana and Sita, and in the bottom there is Krishna and Arjuna in their chariot. So why should these paintings, and these were drawn by the great painter Nandlal Bose of Bengal, who is considered as the father of Indian modern painting. So these beautiful paintings, and there are some more, which I will show in a few pages upcoming. So the pages of Indian Constitution contain the painting from Ramayana and the Mahabharata that are like eternal lampposts of Indian civilization. So this nation is defined by the values of dharma, the right conduct, outlined in these great epics, which played a major role in creating Indian civilization. So this is very important to understand, that Indian nationhood is civilizational. So that's how our constitution starts with the word India, that is Bharat. So Bharat is the most ancient name given to our country. Bharata Varsha, it was called. So even before the Britishers came, even before all the other empires that we read in our history textbooks, in very, very, very ancient times, including the days of Mahabharata, the idea of Bharata Varsha existed. So the geographical boundaries of this nation, starting from Himalaya to the ocean on both sides, it is so evocatively described in texts like Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata mentions the 56 nations, Rajyas they are called, Anga, Vanga, Kalinga, Dravida, all the regions of India as they exist today are mentioned in the Mahabharata. Similarly, in the Tamil, classical Sangam literature, it talks about Himalayas and the Ganga and the land that is bound by two oceans on two sides. So a poet in Purananuru, when he extols a Pandya king, he mentions these boundaries of the nation in which the kingdom of the Pandya is located. So the idea of Bharata Varsha as a nation is very ancient and it is civilizational. And there is civilizational unity amidst diversity and plurality. There is no nation on earth which has so much diversity as our country. So many languages, so much cuisine, so many varieties of dressing, so much specimens of architecture, culture, folk art, everything. But in spite of that, there is a civilizational unity. So some other paintings from the Constitution book I have shared here, the Nataraja icon that you see, which is a glory of the Tamil sculptural mastery. So that finds a place in our Constitution book. And the teachings of the Buddha, that painting is also there. So we have a shared culture, shared heritage, and shared history. So these are the things that make a nation. What makes a nation? It is this that makes a nation. So in that way, India is a unique nation in the whole world, because this nation was born not because of, as a political arrangement, not because some big tyrant or some big invader captured this whole territory and then under his command, whatever was there, it all became one nation. It was not like that. Because if that was the case, we wouldn't find so much diversity in this nation, right? We will find only uniformity. The very reason we find this unity in diversity, because it was built through some great kings and great rishis who saw the oneness among the many and who were inspired by the free spirit. So truth, beauty, and goodness, as we say, Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. So these are the values that they cherished, and they built a civilization which will hold this nation together. And that is what that epithet, India, that is Bharat, at the start of our constitution defines. So now we know, since we know that the whole nation is civilizational, its entire history is to be looked at from this perspective. So what are the high and low points of history for India? So any period where, the Indian civilization grew and bloomed and it produced great people, great warriors, great thinkers, great scientists, great poets, great art, great prosperity. Those were the period, those were the high points for India. And there are periods, dark periods in our history when it was invaded, looted, and plundered. Its civilization was attacked, and people really had to fight and sacrifice to regain that civilization back. So that is a period of struggle. So India's history, as it stands, is filled with, you can, so to speak, the low and high points of its civilization. Now coming to the British rule. So some people, quite a few people, because of notions, they think that British were the ones who brought the modernity, the technology, and everything else, the railways, the roads, and everything, the education, etc., to India. And without the British rule, we would be living like savages. This is an absolutely wrong viewpoint, which was actually enforced during the British rule itself, because British had a selfish interest in brainwashing Indians that the Indians were like brutes, and Britishers are the ones who are bringing them the culture and everything. But unfortunately, even after independence, this wrong view of history has persisted amidst us. How was the British rule like? So much insight has been given on this by many of our great historians, including the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, whose area of research was the famines of India. Many of us don't know that millions of Indians died in famines during the British rule in the 1800s, which continued even till the middle of 1900s. The Great Famine of Bengal happened in 1943 during the Second World War. And when the Winston Churchill was the Premier of Britain, there was a bumper harvest in Bengal. So much prosperity, but people died of famines. You know why? All that grain that was produced in Bengal was looted at gunpoint by the British and taken to the war front to feed their soldiers fighting in different parts of Europe. And Indians, just even in spite of producing so much food, died of starvation and disease. That's just one example. But before that, between 1850 and 1890, there have been like 29 famines across India. No part of India was spared. So why this wasn't, famines are not a new phenomenon for any country, right? Particularly a country like India, whose agriculture primarily depends on the seasons. But in all the previous famines, India had developed very good mechanism. People would migrate to other place. There were support systems built by, there is this great tradition of Annadanam, as you all know. Giving of food has always been cherished in Indian culture. So nobody went starved in spite of famines. But during the British rule, because of the ruthless and cruel policies of the British. So I'm sure you have read about things like, British forced the Indians to grow indigo, which was used for, it is a dyeing material, right? The dye that is put on the clothes, so that they can sell their textiles across the world. And in all the great fields of India where the food was grown, it was all replaced by indigo. And there were great revolts by the farmers against this policy. And then the Indian crafts, industry, economy, everything was destroyed. So the British broke the looms of Indian weavers, which produced the best of textiles in the world, like the muslin clothes. And then they directly looted all Indian wealth. So even today, if some of you get a chance to go to museums in London or New York, you see so many of the beautiful bronze icons from the temples of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and other places, with a label gifted by India, but it was not a gift. The British just looted. But antiques is only one thing. They looted so much gold and diamonds, which Indians had earned through their sheer hard work and trade and all kinds of things. So the loot was both direct and the indirect. And the third thing that the British rule did was that the indigenous education of India, which produced great people like Thiruvalluvar, Aryabhatta, Varahamihira, Adi Shankaracharya, and the great kings and warriors of India. So this was a knowledge society. This entire indigenous educational apparatus was destroyed, and it was replaced by what is called Macaulay's education system, where the stated motive of that system was that it is to make Indians forget all their glorious culture, their achievements and everything, and create an impression in their minds that it is the British who are bringing them everything, and it would produce clerks who will help in the British administration. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi acutely was aware of this. So once during his conversation, he mentioned the India's indigenous education was a beautiful tree which was brutally cut by the British. So another researcher, Dharampal, he took a cue out of that word, and in the 1960s, he went and accessed the entire British archives, and he found incriminating material that spoke about how the education system was widespread in India, even when Britishers were ruling. So we were told stories that only the higher classes in India were educated and all others were simply living in darkness. So this is all an utter lie. In fact, Dharampal proved with Britishers' own evidence that all castes of India, starting from the the highly educated Brahmanas, the warriors and the merchants and the laborers, even including people who are currently classified as scheduled castes. So people from all these castes were enrolled in village schools, and they were taught basic alphabet, mathematics, and morals, ethics, everything. So the lies that the British perpetuated are all being exposed now. So this was how India was ravaged during British rule. And obviously, any self-respecting people would revolt against this. So did the Indians revolted. And what were their inspirations? So there were many inspirations for freedom struggle. So in the earlier history, there was the great Vijayanagara Empire, founded by Harihara and Bukka, which produced great kings like Krishnadevaraya. So that resisted the Islamic invasion into the south of India. It was one of the most glorious empires of India, Vijayanagara Empire. That was an inspiration. And Shivaji Maharaj, who rose from a very humble background, and he built a great empire, Maratha Empire. He was an inspiration. Maharana Pratap, the Rajput king, who never surrendered to the Mughal powers. He was an inspiration. Guru Gobind Singh, who created a martial army of his followers. These were great inspirations. And then there was a heroic early rebellion against the British. There is Kittur Rani Chennamma, a heroic warrior from Karnataka. She ruled a very small kingdom, and she never succumbed to the British manipulations. She fought and died. And Marudu brothers from Tamil Nadu, Shivaganga, right? So they resisted the British, and they valiantly fought, and finally, due to some treachery and other unfortunate circumstances, they were caught, and they were hanged by the British. Narasimha Reddy, another tribal warrior from Andhra, so he fought against the British atrocities. And then all this together erupted into 1857 First War of Independence. As we know, how the Indian Sepoys, the soldiers employed in the British army, revolted against their own commanders. Some of you would have seen the movie Mangal Pandey, where this history is portrayed. And then the sannyasis and sadhus, so they rebelled. They fought against the British. It's called the Sannyasi Rebellion. And then there was an organized revolution with leaders like Bahadur Shah Zafar, Maharani Lakshmi Bai, and Tantya Top. So this was a daring first rebellion by Indians in a very coordinated manner. but still because of some internal weaknesses, and because the Britishers had a very powerful army, this rebellion was crushed by the British. But the memory of it, that inspired the next 2 generations of freedom fighters and motivated them to fight for freedom with even more vigor. And central to the freedom struggle was this idea of, this idea, it was not a past idea, it's a living idea of Bharat Mata. So this idea of viewing the nation as the mother, it's very much a part of Indian civilization, So in all Indian languages, we say Matrubhumi. In Tamil, we say Thai Nadu. So we call it motherland. So you will be surprised. So not many languages have words like motherland, actually, across the world. But in India, it's a very popular concept. It comes from very ancient times. So in the Atharva Veda, the Rishi says, Mata Bhumi Putroham Prithivya. This earth is my mother. I am her beloved son, he says. So till today in India, we all consider earth as sacred, right? So in Tamil Nadu, if you go, every household put these rangolis called kolam. Why is it put? It is to adore the earth, because we respect this earth as our mother, Mata. And it is this feeling which reverberated in that slogan Vande Mataram, which actually means, Mother, I bow to thee. So this Vande Mataram song, which was written by Bankim Chandra as part of a novel, it became such a big rage, and it became the mantra of the freedom struggle. Why? Because it was not a new invention. It was a feeling that was there in crores of Indians' heart already. So it was just a matter of time before a poet came and expressed it in such a powerful slogan called Vande Mataram. And it immediately, like a volcano, it erupted and inspired. And on the left side, you see this painting of Bharat Mata. This was the first painting of Bharat Mata, clad in saffron robes. So this was drawn by Abanindranath Tagore, who was the brother of Rabindranath Tagore. You see how he visualizes Bharat Mata. So beautiful. So he visualizes her as saffron is always a symbol of sacrifice in Indian culture, with 4 hands. So in one hand, she holds the book that represents the knowledge. And in the other hand, in the other 2 hands, she holds the grains and the cloth. So that means that prosperity and livelihood for all people. And in another hand, she holds the Japamala, which means that the spirituality as the ideal. So this was his conception of Bharat Mata earlier. And through that, so we have many portrayals of Bharat Mata. One very popular one, which you see on the other side, that within the map of India, you have Bharat Mata standing on a lion, smiling. So it is this idea of the nation as the mother that continues to inspire us to all Indian patriots. So this freedom struggle took many expressions. So the first one was Swadeshi. I already told you how the Indian economy got devastated during British rule. So the first response of the Indians was in the economic front. So V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, who is called Kappalottiya Tamilar. So he started the Swadeshi Steam Navigation Company. Such a daring attempt, the Britishers could not even imagine that an Indian, so because the entire shipping trade was monopolized by the British, They never thought an Indian would dare to start a shipping company. But unfortunately, but V.O. Chidambaram Pillai did that and proved that an Indian can do such a thing. And for this, he suffered so much. He was put in harsh prison. And the other great industrialist was Jamshedji Tata, who showed that Indians could manufacture their own steel. So much so that the quality of the steel that was produced by Tata was so much that at one point of time, the Britishers had to admit that the Tata steel's quality is better than the British steel. And then there were many attempts by the small scale industrialists, and this became a slogan that buy Swadeshi, boycott British goods. So this picked up. So it was, so contrary to what we think, the freedom struggle was not just a political struggle. It was primarily an economic struggle, which was to regain the economic power for India, which the Britishers had dismantled. And then there was a real armed revolution and struggle as well. So Sister Nivedita, who was actually an Irish woman, but she was inspired by Swami Vivekananda, became his disciple. Her original name was Margaret Noble, which she changed to Nivedita, which means someone dedicated for India. So such an inspiring personality, a very powerful writer. So she was the center of all the revolutionary movement in Bengal, like the Anushilan Samiti, where Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, Rosh Bihari Bose, all these people were actually at one point disciples of Sister Nivedita. Just imagine, an Irish woman, she fell so much in love for India that she learned Indian languages. She adopted the Indian lifestyle, and she wrote a beautiful book called Web of Indian Life, where she appreciated every small aspect of India, its villages, its people's innocence, how even in poverty, Indians are graceful. That was Sister Nivedita. And then there was Veer Savarkar, who was called Prince of Patriots by none other than the ex-Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who was a Congress Prime Minister. So Veer Savarkar underwent the most excruciating punishment in the cellular jail of Andaman for 8 years. A punishment in a jail chamber where even the sunlight would barely penetrate. Such hardships, all because he coordinated an armed revolution against the British. Rash Bihari Bose was the one who started the Indian National Army, which Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose later took over, and that played a great role in the armed struggle. Bhagat Singh, a youth who had barely reached his 20s, he kissed the gallows. Why? To achieve freedom. So this revolutionary movement in freedom struggle was crushed by the British because it was not sustainable beyond a point due to many reasons. If you study this history in great detail, you will understand that. But the armed struggle was the precursor to the political movement that was later started under the leadership of Gandhi. So there is a tendency among people to say that, oh, the revolutionaries were the failure and it is the political movement, so non-violence and without blood, our freedom was achieved. I think, in my humble opinion, these were very wrong notions. In fact, so much blood was shed by the revolutionaries, and only on that inspiration, later the Gandhi's non-violent movement took shape. So we really don't want to, give a lower status to our freedom fighters among the violent and non-violent ones. Both are to be respected. And the political movement of freedom struggle is very well known, and this is what is taught mainstream in all our history books. Lala Lajpat Rai, the Punjab Kesari, and Madan Mohan Malaviya, who was not just a political leader, but a great educationist. So he started the first university started by an Indian in modern area, the Banaras Hindu University. And that gave way to so many other national schools, national colleges, and national universities across India. And C. Rajagopalachari from Tamil Nadu, a great statesman and educator. Sardar Patel, who unified all of India after we achieved independence. So this political movement of freedom, and the freedom struggle was not just a political one, as I already said. It was also a renaissance in many ways. So it is not just politics. In every field of human endeavor, there were new ideas and new thoughts in India. So in the sphere, and each of these developments helped the other. So every one of these renaissance played a part in India's freedom struggle. So in the field of religion and spirituality, the Arya Samaj, started by Swami Dayananda Saraswati, played a great role. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and his foremost disciple Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda, started a great movement. And in fact, Swami Vivekananda was the first person who went out of India, as a Hindu monk in 1893 to the New World, United States of America. So he was a slave citizen of a British India, but he went to the United States of America, which was an emerging power, and he, with single-handedly, with the sheer power of his knowledge and his personality, he captured the imagination of the world stage and raised the prestige of India in the world stage. Sri Aurobindo, Ramatirtha, Ramana Maharshi, Sri Narayana Guru of Kerala, these were great spiritual stalwarts. And in the field of science, you know very well that Srinivasa Ramanujan, the mathematician, Jagadish Chandra Bose, the physicist and the biologist, C.V. Raman, the Nobel laureate, who invented the Raman effect, Prafulla Chandra Roy, the great Indian chemist, S.N. Day, Shambhunath Day, who played a great role in inventing the cholera vaccine. Satyendranath Bose, who played a crucial role in quantum theory's invention. Yellapragada Subbarao, who was called the Wizard of Wonder Drugs, a father of modern drug discovery, and Meghnath Saha, great Indian scientists of the modern era. And in the fields of literature and arts, we had Tagore, Subramanya Bharati, Ananda Kumara Swami, who explained the greatness of Indian art, Indian music and dance to the world. Raja Ravi Verma, the painter, Nandlal Bose, whom I mentioned already, Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, who systemized the Hindustani music, and Dada Saheb Phalke, who was the father of Indian cinema. In the social movements, we have Raja Ram Mohan Rai, who played a great role in empowering women and eradicating social evils. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Dr. Hegdewar, who started this organization, RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, to inculcate discipline among people and unify the nation. And Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who raised the voice of equality and became one of the authors of Indian Constitution itself. So all these movements contributed to the modern India in great measure. And now that we went through this history, before I end my talk with dreams for India, I just want to spend 2 minutes on decolonization. So the colonial rule is gone. The Indian economy is, India is among the top economies of the world. Our lifestyles have improved greatly in the last 74 years of independence, particularly, after the 1990s. so many of us, including myself, who were born in the lower middle class and middle classes, we could study and we could find great jobs, and our lifestyle and our social status has improved so much in the free India. But still, the colonial impact is still lingering among us on many fronts, and this is what is holding us back, really. So we have to really undertake a process of decolonization, and this is an ongoing project in India, and a most important project. So why it is important? Because we have to assert our national identity and national pride. And without national pride, no country can progress or prosper. And what all we need to do on that front? We have to rewrite our true history. No, I mentioned some of these aspects during the previous slides. We have to rediscover our scientific heritage. So much scientific heritage we have, which we were not even told. So the number system, the numbers 1, 2, 3 that we used, it was called Arabic numerals, but everyone, it is so well known that they were actually Indian numerals, right? So from India through Arabia, they went to the Europe, and because they received it from Arabs, they called it Arabic numerals. And it took some time for them to discover that they originally belonged to India. And similarly, on many fronts, in many areas of mathematics, right? So before Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, invented his theorem, we had the Sulabha Sutras in India, precisely. And in astronomy, in metallurgy, in many other aspects of physics, we have great scientific heritage. We need to rediscover that. And rebuilding our governance, institutions, and all fields free from colonial mindset. Our courts, for example, are still operating largely in the British style. And we need to do a lot more on that front. The way our bureaucracy is organized, the IAS, the administrative service, all these need to be rebuilt with innovation. And we need to give pride of place to Indian languages, Indian heritage, Indian arts. So this process of decolonization is one of the most important projects for India. And only with this, the Indian dream can take off. So I want to end this talk with two great personalities who, in our own time, spoke of the Indian dream. So Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, Bharat Ratna, our ex-president. So he gave a vision of a developed nation. We always had this mindset of a developing country. So we are a developing country. Our roads will be like this. Our automobiles will be like this. So this was the tendency that was unfortunately inculcated in India. So some kind, glorifying poverty and glorifying these kind of things had kind of become a disease. Put science as the enabler of knowledge society. So whether it is space science or the nuclear science, or other the environmental science, satellites, defense. So he personally played a role of a scientist and in fostering science as an enabler of knowledge society, and a great personal role model. He spoke of ignited minds, commitment to the cause, and the hard work and sacrifice. So these are the values. This is the vision that the Indian dream consists of. And at the present, another great personality is our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji. So who continuously inspires us with his Indian dream. Decisive and transformative leadership and action. So he has at the national level, he has worked on problems that remained unsolved for 60 years, 70 years. The integration of Kashmir, for example, the abrogation of Article 370. So this decisive and transformative leadership and action is part of the Indian dream, combining mission mode and long-term goals. So we are so much behind in many things in India that we have to immediately do some things, but also we have to keep the long-term goals in mind. It's a very big challenge for any leader of any country. And technology, if I had told you just 6 years back that you can do a digital payment to your tender coconut vendor, who is, with the Ilanir, we call in Tamil, I'll be able to pay through my mobile phone digitally through a coconut vendor. He laughed at me. What are you talking about? I mean, such things will not be possible in India. But today, it's a reality. It's so much that India has emerged as a country which is the first, which is, it's in the first place in digital payments across the world. So the technology has been harnessed, the power of technology has been harnessed so much. The minister talks about the Atmanirbhar India, and it's not just talk. I'm sure many of you have got your COVID-19 vaccine, and this vaccine, the vaccine administered to a huge number of Indians, it is all indigenously produced. And we even have an Indian vaccine to speak of, the Covaxin. So this results in a large-scale empowerment of people in a very harmonious way. So that the Indian dream of a united, secure, prosperous, and assertive India, anchored in its civilizational nationhood. So that dream we have to take forward, and that should be our thinking and our pledge on this great occasion of 75th anniversary of Indian independence. So I want to leave you with this great quote of Sri Aurobindo. In the introductory talk, this was mentioned, the past, present, and future. The country whose young men are imbued with the glory of the past, the pain of the present, and the dreams of the future, always moves on the path of progress. So with this, I end my talk. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.